Dr. Jalal, you are a Harvard neuroscientist studying all kinds of things, sleep and dreams. And I want to talk about not being able to sleep, about the real insomnia, people really where they just cannot sleep. There's a lot of people that just talk about sleep quality online and this and that. And that's fine and dandy in how to improve sleep. But I think if we understand what's actually happening, it might give people a little bit more insight as to how they can A, get the help they need, but B, maybe there are things they can do.
Yeah, absolutely. So sleep is critical for your survival. Obviously, during the stages of sleep, deep sleep, especially physiological benefits, deep sleep cognitive benefits. So it's crucial. In fact, if you deprive rats of REM sleep, the dream stage of sleep, they will die, right? So we know this. There was a guy, I just want to preface the whole thing. There was a guy who, he was a Chinese dude. He was watching all the soccer matches of the European Championship for 11 days straight. He didn't sleep. Allegedly, he died from lack of sleep. Okay, so we know this. So sleep is crucial for your survival. So we have that. That's important. Obviously, there's even a disorder. So there's insomnia per se, which is not being able to fall asleep or waking up too early or in the middle of the night in a pathological manner. What's going on in the brain? So you have that, and we'll go into that as well. But there's also an extreme version of this, which is a genetic disorder where you cannot sleep at all. We'll go into that. So remind me if I forget in a moment. But let's take the more normal insomnia that you and I might experience. So insomnia can strike for different reasons. Often people that have trauma or anxiety or have a lot of worries during the day, but mostly pathological mental disorders. You have a lot of insomnia. You see insomnia is very common in these folks. Usually they can't fall asleep within 30 minutes, or maybe it may take an hour. That's when we talk about the dangerous type of insomnia, where it's pathological.
And after today's video, I popped a link down below for 25% off Seed's Daily Synbiotic. Look, I experiment on myself. You know that about me. I experiment with peptides. I experiment with things. I am a guinea pig, and that's what this channel is about. But when it comes down to the gut health, I really focus on that. And Seed has probably been the most powerful thing that I have done for my gut health, independent of actually changing my diet. So they utilize a capsule inside of a capsule, super cool technology, and that's a 25% off discount link. Look, I do not promote probiotics much on this channel. The only probiotic that I promote is Seed, because it's the only one that I really think has the strong clinical data behind it to really reinforce it, because most probiotics end up getting destroyed by the gut by the time you consume them. And I'm telling you, I noticed a significant change. Some other members of my family have noticed a significant change, and friends of mine have noticed a significant change. So that link is down below. Top line of the description is 25% off. You're not gonna find that discount link many other places. So top line underneath this video.
Think about the brain. It has to power down, right? In order to enter the stages, the initial stages that, temperature drops, heart rate drops and all that, it has to power down. The brain waves have to change. When you're awake, they're very frenetic, very quick, and then they have to slow down. The sensory part of the brain that controls your perceptual awakening has to shut down. That's a part of it. Now, often what you see in people with insomnia is that there's something called nocturnal arousal. It's just a fancy name for the limbic part of the brain, the emotional core of the brain tucked behind your ears, being hyperactivated. Now, if it's hyperactivated when you are asleep, you have a problem, because it can tickle the cortex, the sensory part of the brain, allowing you not to be, and so you can't shut down your brain. You can't shut down the various parts of your brain. Does that make sense?
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
So think about it this way. If I have a lot of amygdala and limbic emotional activity during my day, I walk about, I maybe have anxiety or I have depression or trauma. Actually, depression is a separate case altogether, because fragmentation of sleep is all over the place in depression. It turns out people with REM, depression, we talked about, you and I chatted about how REM sleep, for example, you have a little bit of REM sleep in the early part of the night, and then you have more REM towards the late part of the night. And the reason for this is that your brain may favor physical healing, being physically well established, because that's the function of of deep sleep to heal your emotion, your growth, your cells and skin and all that. Whereas it seems that REM is more important for cognitive and emotional healing. So your brain may, in you and I, and the guy on the savannah, on average, he favored having deep sleep early in the night and then having REM later in the night, because, if you for some reason were, woke up after 4 hours of sleep, you could still sprint and not maybe catch an injury and be eaten by a tiger. So we said that, right? Now, it turns out if you have clinical depression, if you are depressed clinically, then you will have tons of REM in the initial stages. So you might have half an hour of REM. It's called REM latency and onset. A lot of REM because your brain now favors emotional healing. You are so emotionally, in agony during the day that you just need REM sleep. You need that emotional healing, and so you have tons of REM in the early stages of sleep. But that comes at a cost. Because you can imagine now if you have a lot of REM sleep early in the night and an attempt at emotional healing, at what cost though? Deep sleep is less, right? And so these guys will have less deep sleep with depression, and then they wake up in the morning and say, I don't have a lot of energy, I feel tired all the time, what's going on? Well, now you have the answer. At least partially, it's because they didn't have a lot of deep sleep. Their brain favored REM. Whoa. So this is insomnia in that general sense. Stress, for example, if you're very stressed during the day, you have a lot of noradrenaline. You have that in PTSD in the clinical sense, for example, or anxiety disorders, OCD, for example, but also in people that are very stressed all the time. I have to catch this, I have to do this, I have to, write that, new check and do all this. The noradrenaline, again, makes it hard for them to go into deeper stages of sleep and get, benefits of sleep. And then overall, the sleep is more shallow. You have a harder time falling asleep and powering down because your brain is overactive. Noradrenaline, as we talked about, in the brain stem, locus ceruleus, that part of the brain where noradrenaline is produced, is important for keeping us alert. But if it's alert all day, hyper alert in fact all day, you have noradrenaline and adrenaline in your body hyper activated all day, then it's hard to power that down and allow you to go into to sleep. So those are some explanations for that, for the general insomnia. Do you want to talk about the extreme pathological insomnia? Because I find it's very fascinating.
Yeah, I think we should hear about it, because those are the people that just can't sleep, right?
And I think it serves a deeper point as well, because it teaches us how important sleep is. So, and how important it is to take care of your insomnia. So there is a guy. This is a case study of this person. He had it started out like this, in fact. For some reason, he couldn't sleep. For a few days, 5 days, 7 days, 10 days, he couldn't sleep. What's going on? I can't sleep. I can't seem to fall asleep. So I thought he was his, wife snoring. So he went down to the couch and slept on the couch instead. So, left a lot of husbands will do this. They'll sleep on the couch if they must. It's called sleep separation. Sometimes can help.
My wife and I sleep divorce all the time. We just sleep in a separate bedroom.
I recommend this strongly.
We prioritize our waking hours together than our sleeping hours together.
This is very effective, very effective stuff, right? Now this guy, Michael Cork, his name was Michael Cork. He said, "Let me just sleep on the couch, because I need to figure. I can't. I don't know what's going on." After about 12 or 13 days, he went to the doctor and said, "What's going on? What's happening?" And the doctors didn't have a clear explanation. They couldn't tell what the case was, why he couldn't sleep. Now it ended up about 20 days later, he would use a cane to walk. He could barely walk after 20 days. Still no clear answer, but he was very tired, very fatigued. His eyes were crying for sleep, and he was kind of walking around with a cane. At that point, the doctors were getting closer to understanding that he was having some sleep pathology, but still not 100% clear. 6 months in, no sleep. Okay, this guy, he was completely bedridden. He had hallucinations all the time, basically dream activity or imagery intruding into wakefulness, because it was just trying to do his thing because he couldn't sleep. Hallucinations, he would have a ton of this. He was tired, fatigued, could barely move. He would communicate using his eyes. He was just completely devastated. 2 years down the line, the chap died. The chap died from this disorder. Now, it turns out he had something called fatal familial insomnia. Fatal familial insomnia, FFI, neurons in the sensory gateway of the brain called the thalamus. The thalamus is a doorway of the brain where sensory information has to go through, like vision, hearing, touch, and it's a path by which the brain can get all the information to come inside the brain. Now, if this part of the brain obviously has to shut down during sleep, otherwise you would feel like you are awake. You would feel conscious, right? It's the consciousness hub of the brain, so to speak, right? And it's raw sensory information. Now, that part of the brain, the neurons there, were dying off, and so for that reason, it was perpetually on, perpetually active. Perpetually sensory information was overloading him, and he could not sleep. Now, that shows us, first of all, how this sensory doorman in the brain, the thalamus, how critical it is, the fact that it can shut down properly. Second, it shows us if you cannot sleep, what the consequences of that are. Ultimately death in this case. So obviously we don't have this rare genetic disorder, most of us, hopefully, but it just illustrates that how critical sleep is.
So then what are the other sort of categories of insomnia? We've got, obviously this extreme case, and then is it usually brought upon by some sort of trauma and then eventually it gets restored, or is it something like people really just battle with legit insomnia, periodic bouts for the entirety of their life?
Yeah, so we see a lot of insomnia in people with anxiety, a lot with PTSD, depression. You see it as well in the pathological realm. You see it a lot. It has to do with the ability of your brain to create sleep depth and the activity of the emotional core of the brain, the limbic portion. How active is the limbic portion? Is it perpetually tickling your cortex all the time? Cortical maturation. It turns out you need also the prefrontal to inhibit the limbic parts of the brain. So there's a continuous dance going on between the CEO, the part of the brain, the logical part of the brain, and the emotional core. Now that dance is sort of a dance where the CEO is doing the inhibiting, and the emotional core is doing the emotional flaring up.
Got it.
And it's kind of the brakes on the brain.
Yeah.
You need that in order to also inhibit the emotional brain from kindling and putting the whole brain on fire, firing up the brain.
Yeah.
So we know that people with depression and anxiety and PTSD have a thinner cortex, so the prefrontal will literally have shrunk, or actually even people that are chronically stressed, and this is important for those who are not necessarily clinically diagnosed, but they are just stressed all the time. It turns out then that even in normal people, so to speak, and healthy people without clinical disorders, chronic stress will thin the prefrontal. There's a lot of receptors, doorways with the brain uses of communications between cells. There's a lot of receptors for that's cortisol can latch onto and devastate and thin the cortex. Even the hippocampus, by the way, is a side note. The memory part of the brain also has is vulnerable to stress. The cortisol can also shrink the hippocampus. That's why if you've been stressed for a few months, you can barely remember stuff. Same story. So chronic stress will also put you at the risk for pathological or insomnia. But I also want to add, there seems to be a genetic component overall in terms of how well you can generate sleep. Think about this all genetically, all our biological parameters of the body and ability to sleep is in many ways dictated by our genetic heritage. Take my dad, for example. He just has insomnia, and he's had this for many years. My grandmother had insomnia as well. I don't suffer as much. I seem to be doing okay for the most part, except when I'm very stressed out, but for the most part. But there's a genetic component in terms of that too. Just to give you an example, there are less than 1% of the population. They have a mutation of genes called DEC2, for example. It's a fancy name for a certain genes that are involved in creating deep sleep. Now, these guys with this condition where they have a condition where they need very little sleep in order to thrive, right? So they can survive on only 3 or 4 hours of sleep. It's enough for them to go by the day. 3 or 4 or 5 hours of sleep. And this has actually been studied. This is a real phenomenon. 5 or 6 hours of sleep, it turns out, then that is enough for them. You and I don't know, but you and I need at least 8 in order to function. But it turns out there's a genetic component to that. And if you have this rare mutation, you will have more deep sleep. You can generate deep sleep much better, even into as you age gradually. As we age, deep sleep becomes more shallow over time, up to 90%. When you reach 90% reduction deep sleep by the age of 70. So as you can imagine, if you have genetics that will make you more likely to have better deep sleep and more deep sleep, then you have the creme de la creme of sleep. You'll have better sleep overall.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So it's, and they don't seem to have any like deleterious effect of
Absolutely not. It seems they to be so. It was said that Donald Trump. I should say this, but Donald Trump. There were talks about him in the early days with my colleagues that he perhaps seemed to sleep very little, and the word was that he was functioning well on very little sleep, and that he had this genetic susceptibility. I don't know if that's true, but there are certain people out there for sure. They need 5 or 6, and that's it. I mean, these guys are the chosen ones in certain ways, right? Because they just need little sleep, much less sleep than the average person.
That's really wild. So do you find that most people, well, actually back up with that, can you recover from these like insomnia episodes and sort of restore sort of, these, the thinning of sort of the layers you were talking about? Like, does that come back if you go through a period of healing and where you're not as high stress? Does that heal itself, or is that once that damage is done, is that sort of done?
That's a great question. So just to preface that, lack of sleep, it's a vicious cycle. What I'm trying to say is a vicious cycle going on. So little bit of, or not enough REM sleep, right? If you have a little bit of just sleep overall being less, that also increases cortisol. So the cortisol will lead then to less sleep, more stress, and then, so it's a vicious cycle where you can see how these things can spiral. And the question is, what can you do then? And can you reverse some of these effects of cortisol and its effects on the prefrontal, and then in that way improve insomnia? Yes, it seems to be the case. The prefrontal can grow thick again, and the hippocampus seems to be able to grow thick again. And that comes about through stress reduction, taking long walks during the days, meditate, things. I mean, if I'm taking the cases of pathological. You don't have like depression or anxiety. That will need its own treatment. But in general, yes, you can. So you can have those structures being lowered, and then you can use certain techniques for insomnia. Like there's obviously sleep hygiene. Sleeping on the same time every day can help set your circadian rhythms. Meaning we have in our brain in the hippocampus and the hypothalamus region of the brain, that's a region that's important for sleep, a little marble structure. That part of the brain, if it has a biological clock, so you can set it more regularly by sleeping at the same time and waking up at the same time each morning, getting sunlight in the morning on your eyes, so you set the clock, and in that way you can help reduce stress by, as we said, meditating, exercising, all cortisol reducing activities. So those would be ways. And then obviously in some cases what they do is they sleep reset is when they will, doctors, I don't do this kind of work myself, but they will have someone with insomnia, they will prevent them from sleeping for a few days. And then that can potentially sort of reset the whole clock. Yeah. They get a buildup of a lot of sleep pressure in this case, and then they can sleep much better.
Interesting. Yeah, that would make sense. I mean, it's almost like sometimes that's inadvertently what ends up happening, anyway. It's like you just sit and resign to the fact that, okay, I'm just not going to sleep good, and just kind of let it go, and then just let the pressure rebuild. Yeah. But the problem is, you have to somewhat do that in a controlled environment, because otherwise you let the the day get the best of you, and you end up being stressed out, and that ends up messing up the cycle. And you can't actually, So,
absolutely. And also, sorry to interrupt you there, Thomas, but I wanted to say, because what I think is critical for the average person is the fact that we have these side givers, time givers in the brain. Again, it has to do with the biological clock. Now, we all sleep. If I was to deprive you of light, so light, what happens as I go about my daily life, and during the day, light hits the optic nerve, travels through the retina to the thalamus. Obviously, we mentioned the thalamus before, the sensory gate, and then goes to the hypothalamus, to this biological clock. Mm-hmm. Now, this will help set the biological clock. The way it does this is that by less intensity of light, signals to the hypothalamus, it says, pineal in the back of the brain, release melatonin, the sleep hormone, right? So this is how it works. This is the function. Intensity of light becomes less and less light signal the hypothalamus, the clock telling your brain now it's time to shut down, it's time to sleep, and the sleep hormone is released. So you have this, and it's very important. And so this means that you should avoid light during nighttime. You should avoid screens, you should avoid iPads, you should avoid all these things as it becomes later and later during the evening. But not only that, it turns out that your biological clock in the suprachiasmatic nucleus, in the hypothalamus, in this part of the brain, is also controlled by other factors. When do you go out and socialize? When did you have that last meal? When did you have that last, checking of emails and work? All this will also set your biological clock. So this is important that these are all coordinated so it doesn't mess up your biological rhythm.
Yeah, I think it's an easy thing to think about your basic sleep hygiene, and I think when you actually think about just what also stimulates you, people often overlook that. It's like everything becomes very basic. I know blue light. I know this is, this I should avoid. I know I shouldn't eat. But when you actually think about, anything stimulatory, like anything that's like what's happening behind the curtain of all those things that you're talking about. We can get into the weeds of the mechanisms of what blue light is doing and this and that, but the reality is at some level it's stimulating you. And it's even things like stress before bed. Don't have hard conversations before bed. Or anything that keep it light. Those are the kinds of things where I think that is such a big lever for me that it's easy to want to just engage. You get home from work and you've got a finite amount of time to actually have serious conversations about the direction of your family's life and things. Right. And it's like, okay, well, unfortunately, you got to find a better time than right when you get home from work when it's within a few hours of bed.
Yeah. No, it's a good point, and I have this issue myself. I mean, my dad, for example. I mention my dad all the time. My mom is like this to some extent, but my dad, whenever I'm traveling with him or anything, he's like the night person. He's just he's very active at night. There's his phones, there's screens, there's everything, and so it's I have to be very careful if I want to have good sleep. I need to really prioritize all that and make sure that I don't engage with his, he want to have dinner at 8 p.m., 9 p.m. I want to have dinner at 5 p.m., for example. And these things like dinner really does these habits affects how our biological rhythm is set.
Let's talk about some other sleep disorders for a minute, like things like obviously you're an expert in dreams. So if we look at sleepwalking, what's happening with sleepwalking, and people go through these periods where they'll sleepwalk or chronic sleepwalking. What is happening in the brain and the body there?
It's a great question. So sleepwalking, I love this. So about 2% of people have experienced sleepwalking. 14% of children have sleepwalking. And now sleepwalking, what's going on? As we cycle through the different stages of sleep, we hit deep sleep. Now during deep sleep, obviously if you look at the signature of the brain, it's powered down. The hippocampus is shut down. The overall activity, we have firing of the brain like this. The big waves called delta waves, signaling that information is being taken from long-term memory to long-term storage. So you have that. But then, occasionally, In some people, you start waking up and you become alert. By meaning alert, I don't actually mean literally alert. It feels like you're alert because you're actually a robot. You're more like an autopilot. At this case, if you look at the brain, the emotional part of the brain, the limbic centers, can activate or hyperactivate the prefrontal, the logical part of the brain, the CEO of the brain, such that you start waking up to a slight degree, a slight awakening, enough that you can project, like you can wake up, you can start to, I should use wake up carefully, not wake up, but you can leave your bed and start walking around. Now, your eyes are wide open, in fact, so it seems like you're awake in some sense, but you are in fact more like a robot, because your prefrontal, the CEO of the brain, the logical reasoning part of the brain, is minimally active, slightly active, only being slightly aroused by the emotional part of the brain. Now, it turns out then the motor regions of the brain are hyperactive, so that's why you can walk, otherwise you wouldn't be able to walk. But also your cerebellum, the part of the brain that has to do with sense of balance, that part of the brain is also active, so that's why you don't fall typically. Now, as you're walking about as a robot, unconscious in fact, you go about, you go around. Often people will go to the balcony of all places. Very dangerous, can be very dangerous. Or they might go out to the kitchen. This is a version of sleepwalking that's called sleep-related eating disorder. Mm-hmm. And they will take raw foods from the fridge, all the while sleeping, all the while a zombie, taking vegetables and chopping vegetables, and they will eat them, damaging their teeth. The knife will damage their fingers, slicing their fingers. It's very dangerous.
I had a friend that had this when I lived in Texas. It was a severe thing. They had to lock his fridge. They had to lock his pantry, and it would happen multiple times per week. He would get down. It was a bizarre thing.
It's insane. Yeah. It's crazy. So they have this, and then they obviously the level of teeth damage and poisoning from foods and eating raw foods and vegetables. And of all people, of all things, they'll eat a lot of frozen stuff, a lot of carbohydrates they will have, but it's terrifying in this way. It's very detrimental. Some people will drive cars. They will go out to the car and start the car and start driving around the town, all the while sleeping. Imagine this. Your brain can do this on autopilot. Drive around. It's dangerous. Let me give you a case of sleepwalking, because I feel like this illustrates what it can lead to. So there was this guy called Kenneth Parks. He's about 23 years of age. He was living in Canada, I believe. And he was having financial issues, stress. Life was horrible, for him at the time. A lot of problems. And so Kenneth, he had a meeting with his in-laws, like his mother-in-law and father-in-law. He's supposed to sit down and have a chat about life, how to figure out his problems, right? To sort this out, this gambling debt he had. And so Kenneth was actually very stressed. That night he was the night before he was to go and meet them. He was sleeping on the couch, the TV buzzing away in the background, he was sleeping, and then Kenneth suddenly opened his eyes and started to walk. Sleeping, going to his car, turning on the engine, and driving 14 miles to his in-laws' house. There he got himself in, went straight to the kitchen, grabbed the biggest knife he could get, went upstairs, and in an agitated frenzy, slaughtered his father-in-law. It's a bloody affair. Then, slaughtered his mother-in-law, and then tried to kill the father-in-law as well, but he was able to defend himself, and he didn't die. Right. Kenneth then went down, took the car, and just started driving, all the while sleeping. Now, at this point, he looked at his tendons, his arms, blood, and he started to wake up, and he realized, my God, what's happening? I think I've killed somebody, he said. Drove directly to the police station and said, I think I've killed somebody. And at that point, it was then revealed that he had, butchered his mother and mother-in-law, and then tried to kill his father-in-law as well. Everybody thought this was, a cry. He was just trying to, get himself out of the situation by saying he was sleeping. Nobody really believed him in the beginning, as you would expect, right? Yeah. Then they had an EEG done on him. It's basically a net-like thing you can put at your brain, and like little antennas, and these antennas can measure the activity of the outer layer, the what's called the cortex, how active it is. And it turned out that during deep sleep, he would go in and out of deep sleep 10 times each night. And this clenched it, really, the case. They found that he actually was doing this in not knowing. He was actually sleepwalking while he butchered them. And this was a big case. How did they end up trying him? I mean, did you know? Yeah, but what I know is that once the actual physiological evidence from the EEG came out, and it showed that he was actually had this 10 times going in and out of REM each night, that suggested that he was actually doing this whole thing while sleeping, and so he was not sentenced. I think that really clenched the case, and he was found non-guilty. So this is my knowledge of it. Yeah, it's so wild though. Can you imagine just like having a relationship with that person afterwards and knowing like it was you, but it wasn't you, but it wasn't. Yeah. It's crazy. There's so many layers to this. I mean, how do you even grapple with this, right? How do you? It shows you how the brain works in these layers, how mysterious it is, right? That at one point you're sleeping, but then you're not sleeping, and then you're doing all these things, and it's incredible. So are there any instances of sleepwalking where, people go through traumatic periods of their life and it induces it, or is it usually a pathological thing that's just kind of just there? Yeah, it's a good question. So it goes back to the whole question about how come we see it more in children, for example, right? And this is because the prefrontal cortex has to at all times inhibit the limbic structures to a certain extent in order to generate proper sleep and the architecture of sleep. Now, if you have in children, you have the prefrontal is not fully matured yet. There's a lack of maturation of the prefrontal, so it cannot inhibit the limbic structures. There's a lack of inhibition there, and that lack of inhibition can explain it. That they have more of limbic activity, more friction in the limbic structures. There's not enough maturation, and so they're more likely to just slip out of deep sleep and have sleepwalking. Now you can imagine this exactly fits our scenario of people with pathologies of the prefrontal and the limbic centers. So if you have trauma, for example, or if you have anxiety disorders, you can then see that you're more likely to slide into deep sleep because less prefrontal inhibition and more limbic activity all the time. And then also during sleep, of course, causing you to have more deep sleep. That's sleepwalking. And I would imagine probably conversely, like just during your waking hours, probably just more, maybe even irrationality. It's just because it can infiltrate you during your waking hours in the same sort of inverse? That's a good question. Not in the sense that you will become, but it's a deep question actually what you're asking here, Thomas, because not in the sense where you say that I became like a zombie when I was awake. Mm-hmm. But in some sense, the depressed people, if you have severe depression, for example, you are much like a zombie. The parts of the brain that has to do with like the prefrontal and logical reasoning, I know I'm aware of myself, that parts of the brain are so thinned out and become, like in terms of time, in terms of temporal activation, sometimes are activated in a later on versus the emotional parts that are dominating. And so you become almost like a zombie. You have the anterior cingulate, a region of the brain below the cortex, hyperactive in depression, and you are almost like an emotional zombie that cannot really do much. And then that's why some treatments target these prefrontals to make the prefrontal more active, and so you can inhibit these lower structures more, these emotional structures more. But certainly this is exactly what's it. It's almost like being a zombie while awake when you have these conditions. Now, what about some of these other conditions? I know we touched on them, a little bit more in some other videos, but things like
even having night terrors, right? Like where people just like wake up. And is there a difference between a nightmare and a night terror? Like people talk about like night terror is almost where you're like waking up screaming sort of thing.
Yeah.
What's the difference between a nightmare and a night terror?
So nightmares is that when you have a scary dream, you see Freddy Krueger. As you mentioned, it's during deep sleep, so it's not very elaborate. It's not like a long and elaborate dream like REM dreams, but it's more like a evocative, very terrifying dream that you remember very vividly, and you wake up and you have a nightmare. Like night terrors, on the other hand, you don't really remember what's going on. You just woke up jolted, screaming, scared out of your pants almost, right? It turns out night terrors and sleepwalking and these sorts of disorders are called parasomnias or arousal disorders. These are really related. They're family disorders that have to do with the fact that the prefrontal and the limbic are in this battle, and it seems that the limbic is almost always, just tickling the prefrontal to awakening, and so you wake up a little bit too prematurely. So this is what these are. Parasomnias are about, like night terrors and things like that, versus a nightmare, which is really can be traumatic memory that your brain is replaying over and over and try to deal with.
Yeah, because night terrors, I've had a couple of them in my life, and it's been like you come out, kind of sit up, screaming, out of breath, panicking, like, and then like my wife would just be like, "What happened?" I don't know. Yeah, I don't know.
That's a good question. So even sleep talking, so people will talk gibberish and talk, and it's also like an arousal disorder if you have, during deep sleep. So in some cases you don't actually wake up and walk about. You just simply start talking all the time.
Does it seem to be genetic?
There seems to be a genetic component. I think it has. Again, if we look at the example before with people that have high quality deep sleep at the one end of the spectrum, then you have other people that don't have enough deep sleep, and their sleep is more shallow. They have more anxiety. And so, for example, in the anxiety disorders, again, panic disorder, trauma, depression, tons of sleep terrors, tons of sleep paralysis, tons of sleepwalking. It's very common in these disorders. When we do clinical treatment manuals, we often have modules for sleep terror, for sleep paralysis, because we kind of know it goes with the territory. Insomnia, arousal during the day, fragmentation of these arousal systems and anxiety and noradrenaline and serotonin ultimately will spill over into the night, and you cannot turn these systems on and off in a manner that's appropriate, and you have more of these disorders.
Interesting. I mean, when we look at, it's fascinating, man. I mean,
it is.
So as someone that really studies what the brain does when we sleep, what happens to our sleep architecture and even just the quality of our sleep and potentially long-term with alcohol and sleep?
Oh, alcohol and sleep. That's a great question. So REM or alcohol suppresses REM sleep. That's one of the functions of REM. What it does, it can think about alcohol as a way of sedating you. It's a sedation, and so a lot of people will use this. I know of people in my sort of extended family, and some people that have used alcohol as a way to just numb their pains and being able to their worries rather, and then be able to fall asleep. So they will have a drink in the night and think, well, this will make me fall asleep, and it indeed will make them unconscious and feel like they're sleeping, but they're not really sleeping. So they're just knocking out their prefrontal lobes, the rational part of the brain, but they're not cycling through the architecture of sleep in a manner that they should. So it can feel like you're getting good sleep, and then what it does then is it inhibits the activity of REM sleep, so you get less REM, and then this can lead to REM rebound, and obviously you don't get all the benefits of sleep. We mentioned the cognitive benefits of sleep, the mental, memory, emotional benefits of sleep, of REM sleep, and you're simply depriving yourself of all this, by drinking alcohol. So it's definitely not a good sleep aid, so to speak. On the contrary.
Yeah. So I mean, is it because it's highly GABAergic, right? So you're
highly GABAergic.
So because GABA plays a pretty significant role in our sleep, but probably, also on the surface, it would make sense. Like, oh, cool. Well, if I'm influencing more GABA, but there's like a down regulation that ultimately happens, and you essentially you kind of need more and more and more eventually, right? Is that how it works?
This is also how it works, right? So even though if you get sedated, you can take something like alcohol. Let's say you numb your prefrontals, they activate the GABAergic neurons, and you have more GABA, which makes you more relaxed. This is like a benzodiazepine have a GABAergic effects in the amygdala, for example. They have GABAergic effects there and other places, but ultimately you will need more. This is one thing. So if you take benzos, this is another analogy, another example. You will need more and more and more alcohol, more and more to have the same effect. And then when you don't take the drug, you will feel like agitated and anxious. So it has the opposite effect as well. So definitely this is the case. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, and then if we look at some of these other ones, I mean, like, let's take a look at like sleep paralysis for just a second, because that's another sleep disorder in the whole category of sleep disorders. Again, we touched on it in another video, but just as a basic understanding of what's happening there.
Sleep paralysis. Yep. So each night we cycle through different stages of sleep, as we touched upon, stages 1, 2, and 3, where your body is preparing you for sleep. You enter deep sleep, your brain is cleansing your toxins, and it's helping with blood pressure and heart rate down, immune function, and all that. Great. Then enters REM sleep. Then enters vivid, lifelike, crisp dreams. The ones when you see yourself on the moon, wrestling with an alligator, having tea with the queen. Everything is crazy. Everything is flirting with everything. Everything is warped. Right? So you have REM dreams. Now, in order for you not to act out your dreams and hurt yourself and your sleeping partner, it makes sense for your brain to paralyze your entire body from head to toe. So it does this by releasing inhibitory neurotransmitters from the brainstem, the lower part of the brain, that goes down and inhibits basically you have inhibition going on, and then alpha motor neurons in your spinal cord, paralyzing your entire body. So you are paralyzed during REM sleep. Now, you have the paralysis. Great. Very functional and adaptive. Occasionally, though, what can happen is your sensory regions of the brain, your perceptual centers of the brain, prefrontal and otherwise, can become prematurely activated. So you start waking up and feeling aware. You can see your surrounding, you can scan your room, but you are still paralyzed in REM. The paralysis system in the brainstem is actively paralyzing you. So in effect, you are stuck between wakefulness and sleep. So these two worlds are colliding in a way, right? Where the perception, and you also see here that these two systems can decouple from each other. They are not bound by each other. They are two separate independent systems: wakefulness system, sensory system, and the paralysis system. So this is REM sleep. This is sleep paralysis. You start becoming aware of your surroundings, and you can open your eyes because there's a different circuit that allows you to move your eyes and open your eyelids. Now, being aware, about 40% of cases our research shows, so I've done research on sleep paralysis, for example, in about 7 countries. Fascinating. And we see that people around the world will talk about ghosts and demonic figures coming from the room, approaching them, pressing on their chest, and strangling them. They can't move, they can't speak, of course, and they will sexually violate them. So the type of sexual dreaming we know from normal dreams can spill over into sleep paralysis episodes as well. It's a very terrifying experience.
I mean, it's almost like leads us to believe that, like, maybe we experience these things in our sleep and we just don't remember them, right? We don't like these things. Not saying sleep paralysis we have and don't remember. I'm saying like these things that people see, like demonic figures, and sometimes because are you open to sharing? You said you had a sort of experience with it, and I think that might. Yeah, what happened with you with it?
Yeah, of course. So when I was a teenager, I was in my young teenage years, I was sleeping in my room, and what happened was, at some point, I feel like it was early morning. In fact, I opened my eyes. I realized, my God, I'm awake, but I can't move. I can't speak. What's going on? Like, I'm paralyzed. I literally cannot move right now. It's a very scary feeling at this point. But then I had this overwhelming feeling of an ominous presence in the room. And this was not just a feeling of evil, but it was like packed evil, densely packed evil of epic proportions. This is one of the intriguing things about sleep paralysis. The evilness of the experience, the sense of loom and just evil being there, looming over you and watching you, can be extremely overwhelming. So I had that, and then I felt like a creature was approaching me, was strangling me, trying to kill me. I could read its thoughts. I knew what it was up to. Theory of mind is very active during dreams and REM sleep, so that explains that. But I kind of had an idea. Okay, this is evil. It wants to kill me. It wants to destroy me. It strangled me, held me down, and then at this point, I thought I'm going to die. At the point of strangulation, I thought I'm going to die. I also saw my legs, by the way, flying up and down. This was very spooky. Thought it was over, but I was able to wrestle myself out of it. So I tried, screaming and just moving, and then eventually it went away. Like I woke up and was jolted awake, and I was actually awake at this point. This was a terrifying thing. And what do I do? Like, do I go tell my parents? What do I tell my teachers? Like, mind you, Thomas, at the time I was not a very studious kid. I wasn't good in school. Like, I had a very bad reputation with my family. Like, I was the black sheep kind of thing. So telling them that I had a ghost attack me, it just sounded weird. It just sounded like bloody bizarre. So what do I do? So I decided to go on the internet a little bit, Google it. Like, I saw a ghost. That didn't really lead to anything. So eventually then, later on, I went to Egypt in my early career. Went to American University in Cairo very early on, my young years, and I started to study it more formally and do some research over there and try to compare sleep paralysis in Egypt and Italy and Denmark and see how people understand it in these countries, and depending on what they understand from it, their explanation for it, how that affects the experience itself. For example, we found in Egypt, people will say it's the evil genies of Aladdin attacking them, viciously killing them. This evil presence can be, fatal experience. In Italy, they will talk about witches called the Pandafika. It's like this witch that comes at night, chokes you, kills you potentially. Denmark, people will say it's stress, it's the brain, physiology. And then depending on what people tell you sleep paralysis is, how that then affects your perception of it. And it turned out that in Egypt, for example, it's much more frequent, so people will say they have sleep paralysis 3 times more often versus a Danish person. Wow. And they will say that the paralysis lasts much longer. It feels like the paralysis just lasts for ages. Danish person, it just lasted like seconds. They will say that it's much more fearful, obviously, you can expect that. They say it's like 50% of Egyptians will say I can die from sleep paralysis. Danish person, it wasn't really that scary. It's scary, yes, but it wasn't that overwhelmingly scary.
Yeah, highly logicized.
Highly logicized, right? Yeah. Exactly. And then we found a similar pattern in Italy. Italians will say it's the witches, and then the experience lasts longer, it's more fearful, and much more frequent. I thought, my God, this is a great example of the placebo, or its evil twin, the nocebo effect, where you expect something negative and then you get something terrifying. It's a mind-body type interaction that's going on. Quite stunning to see. And at this point, we're looking at this and I thought, what's going on? And it turns out actually in Egypt and Italy as well, they had much more pathological symptoms come out of this. Depression, anxiety, even trauma-like symptoms in some cases. It seems like they had experienced a trauma from this. And so I often illustrate this using what I call the Little Lisa example, if you don't mind. It's this girl, her name was Little Lisa. It's just fictitious. It's a story that I'm using to illustrate this. Now, Little Lisa, she lives on a fictitious island we call, let's say it's Timbuktu or something. She lives there. And there's a cultural narrative about sleep paralysis. Sleep paralysis is this monster. It comes at night. It looks like this. It looks like Freddy Krueger, for example, right? And then she hears about this monster during dinner with her grandmother. The grandmother might say, "Oh, Lisa, the monster looks like this. Be careful when you sleep. It doesn't come and maybe try to kill you or do these things to you. Be very careful." Little Lisa will go to sleep that night, and she will have, ironically, sleep paralysis for the first time. She will see the monster that her grandmother was talking about for the first time. And then the next day, she's terrified and scared. She has it again. A week later, she has it again. And a month later, it's just become chronic. And from there, she develops anxiety and depression. And then you might ask, what's going on, right? What's happening? How come she never had it before? Suddenly, she had it from her grandmother telling her about it. and suddenly she developed chronic sleep paralysis and suddenly developed depression and anxiety and trauma potentially. What's going on? What's the logic here? What's happening? Now, we think here that her grandmother was planting the ideas of sleep paralysis in her head, in her subconscious mind. Then when she went to bed, she was mulling over that. She was thinking about it. And then whenever she felt, she was self-monitoring, hyper-monitoring any paralysis sensations, suggesting something was holding her down, like her grandmother was saying, something pressing on her chest, like her grandmother was saying. She's kind of hyper-vigilantly monitoring her body, and then engages in confirmatory behavior by immediately acting out any paralysis sensations, meaning in REM, waking herself up during REM and triggering these things on herself, in effect. So she wakes up now during sleep paralysis and has the paralysis, but not only that, she will have the dream imagery planted in her head by her grandmother affect what she's actually seeing, like an augmented reality layover of the experience. The hippocampus coloring the experience, so she sees that monster, confirming that the whole thing is a supernatural, dangerous thing. Anxiety is triggered. Anxiety is through the roof now. She goes to bed the next day, and she has it again because of the anxiety and the expectation of the monster coming back. A week later, she develops what we can say beliefs about this monster personally targeting you as a person. It's coming after me. It wants my soul. So she develops like a lot of anxiety and trauma. And then she goes around, tells her friends around it as well. And it turns out in places like Egypt and Italy, it's twice as common versus places like Denmark. Not only is it per individual 3 times more common for the person versus another person with sleep paralysis, but in the general population, it's about twice as common.
Wow.
Because it spreads like a virus in this way, we think.
Interesting.
It's interesting. I want to give you one last experiment on this just to illustrate this. This was done by my colleague Richard McNally at Harvard. It's a great study. This is when I was a kid in high school yet, when he did these experiments. He had somebody who thought that sleep paralysis was space alien abduction. In fact, this is one interpretation of sleep paralysis in the United States, is space alien abduction, aliens coming down on ships, you're paralyzed, you can't move, and they're probing on you, taking out semen and doing things to you. So this is one version of the sleep paralysis, one explanation, one cultural specific explanation. Now, when these guys narrate their encounter on tape, they narrate it and record it, and then listen to that. They listen to their own story, their own encounter. The alien came down and all that. And then you measure their physiological reaction to it, their sweating, their heart rate, their pulse. It's as profoundly provoked and active as somebody who has PTSD from war. Wow. So you actually have one person went to war, experienced explosions, war, death, and you measure their physiological reactions when they listen to audio tapes of their own traumatizing experiences, and compare that with the guy who talked about an alien. Mind you, this guy is actually just sleeping, and they're comparable. They're the same. That's why I say, for me, sleep paralysis might be one of the most fascinating conditions in the entirety of medicine, because sleeping should be the safest of all.
Yeah.
Yet you have this craziness.
My wife had an episode of sleep paralysis, and I'm going to explain it. I'm not going to go into a ton of detail.
Yep.
And I will ask her permission afterwards if it's okay if we use this, and then if not, we'll just cut it. We were in our first house, which was in it was in Gardnerville, Nevada, which is near Lake Tahoe, down on the Nevada side in the valley.
Yeah.
There was a couple of interesting things that had happened to begin with when the Time Warner cable person or Spectrum or whatever had come over to set up the internet. There was Indian reservations nearby, and he was a Native American fellow. Yeah. He walked in, stepped in the door, took a step back out, said, wow, your house needs to be saged. Something had happened here. I really don't feel comfortable here. Yeah. I don't remember if he ended up sending a different technician or not, but that really planted a seed in my wife and I head. We're like, wow, this guy didn't even want to enter the house. He was like, something bad happened here, right? About 2 months later, my wife had an episode of sleep paralysis. It's the only one she's ever had. And where she was just that. She was frozen up against the pillow. She was awake. Nothing could happen. Shadowy figure, a woman walked in, came in and held her down and was violently shaking her, and she couldn't do anything about it. And then basically turned into a cloud and left. And she had talked about this with people for years, and was well aware that she sounded crazy when she explained it. And it was definitely an episode of like the way she described it. She was like, I was frozen. I was like, I was dreaming, but I couldn't do anything. I couldn't defend myself. Couldn't do it. And then she legitimately had PTSD from that, to the point where, I mean, it affected her. We ended up moving out of that house eventually because it was just like, it affected her that much. And the point is me saying that, like, obviously knowing what I know about sleep paralysis, knowing that these things are very real, but also what I'm understanding now is perhaps the undertone of what was set by this gentleman saying, like, something bad happened here, right? It's almost like you create this, I could see how a cultural narrative could impact what you see, and who knows what's actually real or not. I mean, maybe it's cultural narrative, maybe it's actually real in that culture to be more like spiritually aware of these things, right? Where it might be in an area like Denmark, maybe they're a little more closed off to those spiritual experiences. That place in Egypt, they might be very open to that. So it's just a reality for them. Whereas like in another region, that's just not a reality. Right? In the US, not a very spiritual place, but aliens would make more sense, right?
Yeah. That's wow. That's amazing. From one experience, you develop.
One experience.
That's incredible.
And I mean, I can't say it was clinical PTSD, but it rocked her. Let me just say that. I mean, it rocked her to the point where it's like that was an experience that changed her.
That's fascinating. That's really fascinating, because usually what happens is that it's multiple experiences, like small traumas, because they have it over and again. So if it's one profound experience, that's really like, that's case study stuff. I mean, that's really intriguing, actually.
Yeah, she'll be I think excited that I even brought it up.
No, it's amazing.
It's hard to get validation with something like that.
No, it definitely is very true. Even my own experiences profoundly changed me. I mean, we talked about earlier how dreams can affect you. Well, this is an example of a dream type scenario where you are deeply affected to the extent that you develop mental disorder, that your brain literally will change its structure. So in people with PTSD, the brain structure will change. When they develop the PTSD, the hippocampus will shrink, the amygdala will balloon up, the prefrontal will shrink. I mean, you have literal structural changes. And so from just sleeping, which should be the safest of all, and here you are, having encounters with intergalactic aliens and, seeing witches and all this crazy stuff. So it's insane. And even beyond this, you know that during sleep paralysis, you can also have an out-of-body experience. I don't want to go off tangent too much, but just to add to the whole flavor of the craziness, occasionally you will have an out-of-body experience where you feel like you're floating out in space. So you see a copy of yourself hovering over you, and it's typically, so I've had this, I saw a copy of Balant hovering over me, and the topic of conversation is usually, who's the real me? The Balant up here or the Balant down there? So there's a hijacking of identity almost. It's crazy. And again, it has to do with the part of the brain we mentioned earlier called the TPJ, the part of the brain that has to do with a sense of body image, creating a sense of a self. That region of the brain is disrupted during sleep paralysis and during dreams, and so you can have out-of-body experiences like this. In fact, if I was to zap that part of the brain when you're awake, and you will literally have an out-of-body experience when you're awake. So we know this. So there's a brain structure and activation that can explain all this. But I want to add something here, because you mentioned a great point about what's actually real and what's not real. Yeah. Because as a person, I want to just make it clear that I'm actually a spiritual person myself, despite having talked about science for the last, very long time. I'm very scientific. I do science in my lab, but I'm open to spiritual experiences. I'm open to the fact that spiritual experiences can be real. I don't suggest science can explain all. I'm just hyper truthful to the science, and then say some things we cannot explain. What's the soul? Is there anything beyond matter? But I'm so truthful though that I say, well, I want to explain all this in the brain because there are things we do know, and so I rely on that to explain things that can be explained, but obviously we can't negate things that are outside the realm of science. So I just want to add that though.
I mean, actually, the more that I learn about neuroscience, the more it actually edifies some of my spiritual beliefs and thoughts and experiences. It's just like, okay, well, it's not that there's a reason to why this is happening. It's more so there's a reason that anything could happen.
Yeah, definitely. This is true.
So
this is true.
It's and it's like, much of science becomes so myopic. And the thing I love about like your field is that it's actually, in a lot of ways, it's the opposite of that. It's eye-opening and it's expansive.
Yeah.
And you realize that, and I think that, we live in an era where it's everyone just wants to follow the science all the time. In reality, is that's living in the immediate past, right? It's like then there's this whole world beyond that.
Look, this is very true. As I always say, this is an example that I've used so many times. Is look, if I was to tell you 100 years ago that on your skin right now there's a trillion of small animals crawling there, you would say I'm crazy. Before the microscope, they would think you're being insane, or that you can chat with somebody but looking at a box and he's in Australia and you're talking to him and you're looking at a box.
Yeah.
How's that possible, right? But we know that science, right? So things that are beyond the capabilities of the human brain right now doesn't negate the fact that you could have spiritual dimensions right now, but they're invisible to us. And so this is for a super scientist. Obviously, I don't go into my lab and study spirituality, but you have to be open to this.
Well, I mean, even there are, Buddhist cultures and Zen culture. I mean, that's your thoughts are an additional sense.
Oh yeah.
Right. I mean, so it's just like, and you think about like what senses exist that we're just unaware of, subperceptible, right? It's just it would almost be. It'd almost be foolish to think that they don't exist. Of course, there's other senses. I mean, we learn so much more. I mean, then you start bringing down to like, how does EMF impact us? Well, there's a sense that we're unaware of, right? Like, it's so just keeping an open mind, right? I mean, it's just, I don't know, it's fun, and it becomes a practice to keep an open mind and just enjoy the ride.
It does, and not to go too much down the rabbit hole, but it's actually, we have a structure. So the whole limbic structures we talked about before, crucial for dreams, the dopamine and emotional salience of the world, and gauging that whole that the world in an emotional way. It turns out people that have temporal lobe epilepsy, meaning neurons go ballistic and they fire, in a crazy manner, meaning that you have what's called effacement. Kindling neurons are very hyperactive in these focal seizures. You will develop a strange syndrome where your personality become hyper-religious and cosmic and spiritual. So you go around and say the whole world is spiritual. You become almost prophetic. You want to write down. You can't contain your emotions to your own self. So you want to write them down and become poetic. So you have almost like a spiritual personality being triggered simply from the brain activity being hyperactive in a very localized region of the brain. So it's quite fascinating what the brain is up to. But then, as one of my mentors mentioned, neuroscientists of great neuroscientists, he said, well, look, how do we know that God is not actually communicating through these chosen people by activating their temporal lobes? So it's almost how you look at it that's critical, right? So we, as a scientist, we describe the phenomena, the neurons involved, and the regions, and what's going on, the circuits and systems, but we don't overinterpret and negate things that we cannot negate.
Well said. And it's, like, I always think is a thought is a thought before it ever became a thought.
Oh, that's
and who put the thought there, right? So it's,
who put the thought,
and it's like, that's just a mind-boggling question. It's almost a Zen koan in a way, where you think about these things that have no answer, but you just just the sheer act of thinking about them awakens you a little bit to think.
100%.
And it's but again, to bring a full circle back to the things, I mean, it just makes you really want to take care of the organism, whatever it is are, right? Get your sleep, take care of it. And it's so even though you can get off into woo-woo spiritual land really quick, I think you can also root it down to taking care of yourself, right? Or at least the image of yourself.
No, that's very true. I agree. Like, taking care of yourself is critical, and taking care of your sleep, your stress levels, and not shrinking your various parts of your brain that you need for important tasks. This is so critical.
Amen to that, man. Well, where can everyone find you?
Well, so I am on YouTube, Dr. Jalal. I'm a YouTube channel, and I'm on Instagram at Jalal, and Facebook at Jalal. So those would be the places.
Right on, my man. Thank you, brother.
Thank you, brother.